This is the night that either makes me or foredoes me quite. Iago in Othello by William Shakespeare. Hi, that's a slightly unconventional opening to the episode, but I've decided that when a particularly important episode comes around, like this one, I'm going to follow Richard Adams' convention of placing a quotation at the start, because this episode is the most important one yet. So I'm going to place quotes at the start of those, see how that goes. Couldn't resist it. Anyway, welcome to episode 4, which covers chapter 4, The Departure. Now, I've scripted this episode more than before because it's required a bit of preparation, quite a bit of preparation. If that comes across negatively, please let me know. It matters to me how this is all coming across for those of you mad enough to actually listen to this. I'm also briefly going to touch on, I haven't scripted this, an introductory subject, which is the subject of this podcast and copyright. I did look this up because I am podcasting about a work that is still in copyright. I think it's 50 years after the death of the author. Something remains in copyright. And so I've covered myself with here by making sure that I'm not treading on toes from that point of view. If I were to read Watership Down out to you, in other words, give you a free audiobook, that would be a breach of copyright. I could get away with quoting quite long sections from it, but I'm going to avoid that. I'm deliberately avoiding quotation, certainly lengthy quotation. So from that point of view, I believe myself to be on safe ground as far as I've checked it out. But again, I'm always up for any advice on that or any corrections on anything I say like that. Other corrections and clarifications that are needed. I'm still swallowing phrases, I've noticed. The last episode, this was an absolute corker, this was. I said, Fiverr's a nightmare, where what I meant to say was Fiverr's having a nightmare. I just didn't bother with the word having. Now, I've no doubt when Fiverr is having one of his dreams, where he dreams of the future and he panics, he is a nightmare to be in Edinburgh with, but the meaning was Fiverr's having a nightmare. Also, I have fallen for something that I said right at the start I wouldn't do. I said I was going to deal with the books alone and not be influenced by the films. Well, in the very first episode, or the second episode actually, when I was dealing with chapter 1, I fell into exactly that trap. And that's where I said that Blackberry and Dandelion were having the first conversation in the book. Well, actually, in the film version, I believe it's Blackberry and Dandelion, but actually, in the actual book, the rabbits having that first conversation are a rabbit with black-tipped ears and Buckthorn, who clearly later on we learn knows Blackberry. Now, the makers of the 1978 film seem to have decided that the rabbit with black-tipped ears was actually Blackberry. They made the whole top of his head darker coloured, his ears and the top of his head. But as far as I can tell, there's no actual evidence that the rabbit with black-tipped ears is Blackberry. Now, again, if there are references later in the book where him having black-tipped ears is referred to, then I'll correct that. But there's the first challenge to all you Watership Down geeks to prove me wrong there. I'm saying that the rabbit with black-tipped ears at the start of the book isn't Blackberry. Necessarily, it could be, but there's no definite evidence. Will solving this puzzle change the world? Of course not. That's the essence of any geekdom. Embrace it. So, on to chapter 4. Now, this chapter has made me realise how much this podcast will have to be an interrogation of evidence and just how geeky I'm going to have to get about this at times. It's clearly a key section of the book that was used to make editing decisions about the 1978 film version, and I'm going to have to learn to make sure I ignore those decisions if I'm going to stick to the book's text only at first. The opening conversation between the black-tipped eared rabbit and Buckthorn was an example of that. The opening quote in this chapter is about a potential invader in the full version of Hamlet, Fortinbras of Norway. In the shorter versions of Hamlet, he often doesn't appear. But this emphasises how the rabbits who are going to leave will be viewed, as rebels against the chief and traitors, or as something more noble. Having said that, Fortinbras, when he invades at the end of Hamlet, after the royal house have basically killed themselves and each other, Fortinbras actually restores order, so he's not entirely villainous, but just shows how these rabbits are going to be viewed. The chapter starts with an explanation of Fu Inlé, which means after moonrise. And this indicates how rabbits have no sense of punctuality. This is when they said they were going to meet to leave the warren. Now, it could mean any time at night, depending on the time of the month. And at new moon, it means nothing, as you can't even see the moon. So after moonrise, does it include during the day? Because half the time the moon rises during the day. Fu Inlé is a fairly meaningless term, time-wise. Adam's comparison of the way rabbits gather with primitive people, that's in quote marks, primitive people, is a bit awkward to modern ears, I think should be, at least. And after it's not so long ago, we weren't measuring time very precisely here in the UK either, or in the West generally. You know, precise measurement of time is quite a new thing, and if you don't have clocks, then you measure time in other ways. So that phrase primitive people sits a little uncomfortably with me. However, the description of the right time to begin something being a communal venture is beautifully described after this, and it applies to birds as it applies to birds, and it's very true in many animals, including people. The way events start, the way there's a kind of sense of when it's right for something to begin, when there isn't precise timing. Now, what a contrast that is to the opening quote, which compares what is about to happen to an act of treason. Instead, this is a noble venture that just has to have the right time to start. Also, because I cast a critical eye on this book, even though I love it, Adam's treatment of does in the book also needs mentioning, because there are no does in this party at all, none. No does leave the warren. Now, Adams was inspired by R.M. Lockley's The Private Life of the Rabbit. He mentions it several times through the book. Yet apparently, Lockley made it clear that does will often leave a warren to start a new one. Someday I'll actually find a source for that. So, in that case, why is it only bucks that leave the Sandleford Warren? Much as I love this book, a critical eye needs to be used where attitudes of another time seem to have been an influence on it. And in this case, Adams seems to have gone away from what Lockley said. So, on to the leaving party in order. The first arrivals, an hour after moonrise, Fu Inlé, and an hour before midnight as it happens, the first three rabbits to arrive at the ditch are Hazel, who's already been introduced. He's decided that this is where they'll meet. This is where the previous chapter took place, in this ditch. Fiver, his brother, the main protagonist of the reason for leaving, who's also already been introduced. And Pipkin, or Hlao in Lapine, that's Hlao. Now, his name is an important concept for animals that cannot rely on bodies of water for hydration. It's any dip where moisture can collect in grass or whatever, on a leaf, anywhere you can find the moisture, and he's named after that concept. Something small, in other words. He is a small rabbit like Fiver, but doesn't have his psychic abilities. He's not an obvious candidate for this venture at all, and Hazel and Fiver have spent a lot of time persuading him to join them. At this point, it isn't clear why. He's just decided to follow Hazel. They obviously, he's a friend of theirs, and they've decided that he should have the chance to escape the warren. The second arrivals at the ditch are Hawkbit and Dandelion. Now, Hawkbit is a less than intelligent rabbit that Hazel spent some time with during the snow a while before. This gives Hazel a chance to show his leadership qualities, as we learn of his awareness that such a venture will attract rabbits who simply had enough and want to leave the warren, or outskirters, as they're called. Hawkbit doesn't care about Fiver's warning, he just clearly wants out, and Hazel, despite the fact he found him tedious, accepts this and doesn't intend to pick and choose between rabbits. Dandelion, again, as I said with Blackberry, is a good warning. This character is a good warning not to let the film versions influence my commentary on the book. As I said in chapter 2 that Dandelion was the other rabbit that Blackberry was talking to, and actually it was Buckthorn. Dandelion has persuaded Hawkbit to join, and Dandelion later plays a crucial role in the book as a storyteller. There are stories of El Herrera that one will come very soon, that are dotted through the book. Dandelion is the one who tells those. He's the talented storyteller. He also warns that Toadflax, who's the cowslip hogging Owsla member from chapter 1, was suspicious of what he was doing, trying to persuade others to join. The third arrivals are Blackberry, Buckthorn, Speedwell and Acorn. A Blackberry has already been introduced, a highly intelligent rabbit who plays a key role in certain episodes in the book. He, by inference, I said at the start, was possibly the rabbit talking to Buckthorn, but obviously I've now thrown that out there that it may not be the rabbit with black-tipped ears. This is to be confirmed. Now, it's ironic that arguably the most intelligent rabbit in the book provokes such an evidence-based discussion. Quite appropriate, really. These are the exact details that should fuel anyone who's obsessed as I am by this book. I won't be editing previous versions of this podcast at all. If I get things wrong, I'll just correct them later on, because this interrogation of evidence is part of the process. I've already come across assertions about Watership down elsewhere that are demonstrably wrong, and I'm going to take great delight in discussing, as this time progresses, discussing those and going over evidence and being proved wrong myself, of course. That's Blackberry, the intelligent rabbit. Buckthorn is the next rabbit. Now, he is the one who's named in that opening conversation of the book. He's a tough rabbit who is a candidate for the Owlsler, apparently, but for some reason, a fight, a disagreement of some kind, he's become dissatisfied enough to leave instead, which is quite an interesting sign of how much dissatisfaction there may be. And then Speedwell and Acorn. Now, they're not really described very much, except for being, quote, typical outskirters, thin-looking six-monthers. Hazel doesn't recognise them, but again, two outskirters who are keen to leave the Warren and getting a hard time of it. Those two react to Fiver in a way that suggests that they have been told about his prophecy and are very surprised he's not still coming out with more such prophecy, but apparently Fiver seems quite calm. Now that they're leaving, they've decided to leave, Fiver is quite calm. The fourth arrivals in the ditch are Bigwig and Silva. Bigwig has already been introduced. He's the physically strongest rabbit in the group, we later learn. And Silva is over 12 months old. He's got grey fur with patches of white. And he's a new member of the Owlsler, so the second member of the Owlsler who's leaving. And he's a nephew of the Freya Ra, so the chief. I have to ask, how would the rabbits know this? I must research pair bonding in rabbits, but that would be the only way to know his family tree. But in any case, we'll skirt over that. He has been getting a hard time from younger members of the Owlsler about his fur colour and getting his position because of his uncle being the chief rabbit. And he's had enough, according to Bigwig. Now, the arrival of these two gives another chance for us to learn of Hazel's leadership qualities. He's relieved to have such strong rabbits in the group, bearing in mind what they might face. On the other hand, once they settle down in a new warren, such rabbits mustn't be allowed to dominate the likes of Fiver and Pipkin. So that's it. This is the group of rabbits that leaves the Sandleford Warren. 11 male rabbits or bucks and no females or does. The rabbits are Hazel, Fiver, Pipkin, Hawkbit, Dandelion, Blackberry, Buckthorn, Speedwell, Acorn, Bigwig and Silva. So, having established the group that leave, we proceed to the first act of violence in the book. 3 members of the Owlsler suddenly arrive very loudly. The only named member of this party is Captain Holly. He's the leader of the Owlsler. Bigwig confronts him and is informed that he is under arrest for spreading dissent and incitement to mutiny. Further petty charges are levelled at Silva. I won't even bother detailing them, something to do with not being on duty. They sound very human. I'll allow myself to get a bit political at this point by saying that this is clearly a very militarised society that is effectively fascist by our standards, by modern standards. Or is the implication that the rest of the rabbits could have just left with no problems? Because the only rabbits that seem to be in trouble are the Owlsler members. If so, this is just a case of a highly militarised warren in which anyone outside the Owlsler is treated like dirt, possibly? A microcosm of Sparta, maybe? But in Sparta, in ancient Greece, those outside the military elite were slaves and not free to leave. This is not a society that needs slaves. It's got no agriculture. So that actually might this genuinely be a model of a society that now has no human parallel. But that begs the awkward question, what's an Owlsler for? I'll develop this theme a lot further when we encounter Ephrafa, the Warren of Ephrafa, later in the book, as it's definitely a lot more sinister than the Sandleford Warren. In any case, Bigwig attacks Holly as soon as he has finished making his accusations. And the other two Owsla members look to join in, but Buckthorn, who's a potential Owsla member, from the top of the bank, kicks one and then threatens the other. Dandelion then attacks the Owsla member Buckthorn kicked. Both Owsla members run away. And Holly remains, clearly ready for more fighting, but it's Hazel, uninvolved in the violence, who calmly tells him twice to go or he will be killed. Quite a shocking moment. Just very calmly. And this isn't something he can do. Other rabbits will have to do it. He's not large enough to be doing this, arguably. Anyway, Holly leaves after making empty threats about it's them who will be killed. And Dandelion, who's been wounded, says they should leave immediately, as the whole Owsla will be after them soon. He's backed up by Fiver. Hazel says they should leave right away and follow the stream to keep together. Bigwig tries to offer advice, but Hazel points out there isn't time, again showing leadership. So they leave. This episode's been a real education in how complicated this podcast can get. It's all a matter of how far you're prepared to let the geekdom go. This is very much the point at which I need to know if my degree of watered down geekdom is likely to carry my audience. And please let me know with your reviews and comments. I mean, I suspect this episode is going to be the longest one yet. I haven't looked at timings yet. But I'm very interested to know how this is coming across. And, for example, I scripted this one more than before because I need the amount of detail I needed to. In the next episode, the journey begins. And the rabbits learn just how scary things can get. And how quickly.